So we're going to look at how to deal with negative numbers that come across in math problems. They come across in a lot of math problems, so hopefully we can learn to adjust with them. There's basically two sets of rules for negatives. One for adding and subtracting, and one for multiplying and dividing. So we're going to look at the adding and subtracting rules first, because those tend to be a little bit more complicated, and then we'll take a look at the multiplying and dividing rules. So in adding and subtracting, there's basically two rules to remember. The first is that when you add and subtract a negative and a non-negative, or a negative and a positive, your answer is going to be the sign of whatever number is biggest. Right? So if you have a negative 100 and a positive 20, your answer is going to be a negative number because the 100 is the bigger number compared to 20. Also, is that if you're adding two numbers, but one of them is negative, you're actually going to end up subtracting instead. So even though it says addition, it might actually be a subtraction problem since you threw that negative in there. So let's see how this looks here on some of these. So the first one here, we have 20 plus negative 5. Now again, normally we would add 20 and 5, but because it's adding a negative number, we're actually going to basically do 20 minus 5, which ends up just being 15. And my answer is going to be positive because the 20 is bigger than the 5, and the 20 is positive, therefore my answer is going to be positive in this situation. So even though it says plus 5 or plus negative 5, we actually ended up doing subtraction because we're adding a negative, not adding a positive. And the next one's very similar, negative 20 plus 5. Well again, because we have a negative number, we're actually going to end up subtracting these two values instead of adding them. Now again, we're going to subtract them in a way that makes sense here, so let me erase that little dot. And let's go ahead and set this up as a subtraction problem. So 20 minus 5, which is still 15. But in this case, my answer is going to be a negative 15. And again, the reason being is because 20 is bigger than 5. And since 20 is negative, my answer will be negative. So negative 15 will be my answer in that case. So really no different than the first one, except my answer is negative instead of positive. The next one, we have negative 3 plus negative 4. Now again, because they're both the same sign, we're going to add them like normal. I'm basically going to do 3 plus 4. So it's basically 3 plus 4, which is 7. And because both my numbers are negative, then my answer is going to be negative. Now, if I wanted to think about it the other way, I could say the 4 is bigger than the 3, so I'm going to take the negative from the 4 for my answer. But if they're both negative, then my answer is just going to be negative when I add them together. So the main trick for addition is to be on the lookout for when you're actually going to end up subtracting the numbers rather than adding them, because you're adding a negative. So that plus a negative, like in the first case here where we have plus negative 5, or in this case here where we have negative 20 plus a positive 5, be on the lookout for those because you're actually going to end up subtracting rather than adding. Now, when you're subtracting a negative, things can get a little bit tricky because of the double negative rule. So the rule is that if you have two negatives right next to each other, then they both form a positive. So if you hear yourself in a problem say minus negative something, when you hear yourself say that minus negative, circle those two negatives, make them one big positive, because that's what they're going to end up doing. So for example, the first one here, 5 minus negative 3. Well, again, I hear myself say minus negative, so these two negatives right here, they end up forming one big plus sign. So I could rewrite this as 5 plus 3, and that will end up giving me a positive 8. And again, this is because you're taking away a negative value. Usually negative is thought of as debt, like money, like you owe somebody something. If you take away somebody's debt, if you take away a negative, you're actually adding in a positive value. It's a good thing. You're taking away something bad, therefore you're adding something good. So taking away a negative 3 is basically adding 3 to somebody, or adding 3 to something. Now, if you don't like the one big plus sign, there is another way of doing this. The next problem, we have a very similar situation, negative 5 minus negative 3. So what some people will do is they say minus negative, so they go plus, plus, and make them into two plus signs, which is basically the same thing. So if you want one big plus sign or two small plus signs, they're both going to do the same thing. So this is still basically negative 5 plus 3, which will end up being a negative 2, because again, as we said before, I have a negative number and a positive number that I'm adding together. Therefore, I'm going to have a negative number as my result. And the other one here, negative 5 plus negative 3. Now again, be careful here because these two negatives are not next to each other. They're separated by a plus sign. So my answer is going to be a negative 8. 5 plus 3 is 8. Take the sign of the bigger number, I'm going to make it a negative 8. So don't overuse the double negative rule, but do make sure you remember it because it does pop up from time to time. The other thing here is when you're subtracting a negative from a negative value, or when you're subtracting a number from a negative value, like in this case here, we have negative 5 minus 3. What ends up happening is it looks like this. Negative 5 plus negative 3. That's essentially what you're doing there, is you're doing negative 5 plus negative 3, which will end up giving you negative 8. One way to think about this is that you've lost $5, then you're going to lose $3. So how many dollars have you lost? Well, you've lost a total of $8. Think about it as losing money. You've lost 5, so that's a negative 5, minus 3, so you lose 3 more. So now you're left with a negative 8 because you've lost a total of 8. Same thing in this one. Negative 10, so you've lost $10, then you lose 2 more dollars, so you've lost a total of $12. So you got negative 12 in there. And in this case, to be careful, because this is back to the double negative rule here. We have negative 6 minus negative 4. So the money really doesn't make sense here. I have lost $6, then I lose negative $4. Again, that doesn't really make too much sense. So if you have something like that happening there, then you look, okay, here's my double negative, so I need to change this to be negative 6 plus 4, or plus positive 4 if you want. And that will end up giving me a negative 2, because again, negative 6 is bigger, so I take its sign. Oops, don't want to erase my negative there. There we go. So when you're subtracting a number from a negative, you're going to basically get a bigger negative, so to speak. You're going to increase your debt. And as I did in the first one here, some people, to avoid this problem, do the little plus and minus thing I did right here with the 5 and the negative 3. So for example, in this case, if I scroll this back down, give myself some space, people will say negative 5 minus 3. So they'll go to the minus sign, they'll do plus negative. And then they'll say, okay, now I'm just adding 2 negative numbers. I can do that. That's just negative 8. Or he'll do 10 minus 6. So even if you don't have a negative, you do 10 minus 6. Well, that's 10 plus negative 6. Well, 10 plus negative 6, that's positive 4. Because, again, we're adding a negative, so we actually subtract. And here, again, that double negative creeps up. So you have to do your own little thing here. So it'd be negative 2. These two make plus positive 4. So that would be a positive 2 as a result. So still be on the lookout for that double negative when it pops up. But subtracting a number from a negative is almost just as commonly missed. So if you're taking away something from a negative, you're going to get a quote-unquote bigger negative. Now, multiplication and division have their own rules, which are usually a lot simpler because they don't revolve around figuring out what number is bigger or whatnot. It's just a matter of how many negatives you have in the problem. So here's a little chart we can kind of use to organize our thoughts, and here's how it goes. A negative times a negative is going to be a positive answer. So you get a positive number when you do a negative times a negative. A negative divided by a negative is also a positive answer. And then these two are the same way. A positive times a positive is a positive. A positive divided by a positive is also a positive. Those are just normal numbers that we work with. Now, if I have a negative times a positive, that's going to give me a negative answer. And then the same thing down here, a positive times a negative. If I switch them up, it's still a negative answer, even though they're switched. Here, a negative divided by a positive is also a negative. Negative. And then down here is also a negative as well. When I have a positive divided by a negative, it's also a negative. So this is a chart showing all the different possible multiplication division outcomes for signage. But instead of using the chart, some people also think about it a different way. So if I scroll down here a little bit. If you have an even number of negatives that you're multiplying or dividing together, then your answer will be a positive answer. So 2 negatives multiplied to each other will be a positive. 4 negatives multiplied to each other will be a positive. 6 negatives multiplied to each other will be a positive. They're all going to be positive if there's even. If you have an odd number of negatives, however, then your answer will be negative. So if I multiply 3 negatives together, I'll get a negative answer. If I multiply 5 negatives together, I'll get a negative answer. If I multiply 11 negatives together, I'll get a negative answer. So an odd number of negatives is a negative answer. An even number of negatives is a positive answer. That's what we have up here. We have one negative, so negative answer, one negative, negative answer, one negative, negative answer, one negative, negative answer. So 1 is an odd number, so if I just have one negative, I get a negative answer. Here, 2 negatives, so positive, 2 is even. 2 negatives, so positive because 2 is even. 0 negatives, so again, positive because 0 is even. And 0 negatives again, so positive still there. So if you want to think about it as the chart, you can. If you want to think about it as positive and negative, how many negatives you have in terms of odd and even, you can do that as well. So let's run through some examples here just to make sure we have this. Get myself situated here. So let's start with the top here. Negative 2 times 3, or sorry, negative 3 times 2, my bad. So 3 times 2, that's 6, so the multiplication goes the same that way. 1 negative, so negative answer. 3 times 2 is still 6, still 1 negative, so negative answer there. Negative a bit better. Negative 3 times negative 2, so 2 times 3 is 6, and I have an even number of negatives, so my answer is a positive. 10 divided by 2 is 5. I have 1 negative, so it's going to be a negative 5 because 1 is odd. Here I have 10 divided by 2 is 5. Again, 1 odd negative, so negative there. And then I have 2 negatives here, so my answer is going to be a positive 5. This rule also works if the division is formatted like a fraction. So here is 20 divided by negative 4. That's going to be negative 5. Again, 20 divided by 4 is 5. And then I have 1 negative, so I have a negative answer. And then here I have 2 negatives, so my answer is going to be a positive 5. So you don't have to worry about switching up whether you multiply or divide like you do with adding and subtracting. You just have to worry about how many negatives you have in each case. Lastly, how negatives interact with fractions. This is one that kind of trips people up a little bit. A fraction technically is a single value. It's a single number, even though it's written with 2 different numbers. A fraction, like I said, is basically an unsolved division problem. So if I have a negative fraction, technically speaking, it's one negative number. Negative 1/2 is negative 1/2. It's just one negative value. Same thing for 2/3, 4/5, 10/12. There's negative is just a negative number. However, in some cases, it does make sense to split the negative across both values. Scroll down a little bit. Split the negative across both values because it helps us work through the problem. So, for example, negative 3/5 technically is one negative number. But if I wanted to, I could write it, my bad. I could write it as negative 3 over a positive 5. Or if I wanted to, I could write it as a positive 3 over a negative 5. All of these here are the exact same number. There is no difference between any of these 3 forms. Most of the time, it's better to think about it as one negative number, but in cases like when we multiply 2 fractions together, or solving an equation, or stuff like that, it can be helpful to actually assign the number to one of the values, not both. So for example, if I did this, negative 3 over negative 5, that is not the same number as what I started with. So this does not work because if I have, as we said, 2 negatives, they will cancel each other out, and I will get one positive answer in that case because the division rules still apply. So when it comes to fractions, it's an either or case. You can think about it as a single negative number, or you can think about it as 2 numbers where one is negative and one is positive. It just depends on what you're doing, but all 3 ways are correct. Hope you enjoyed the video. Have a good day.